슝디 질 도디콩다 규콩 니 셰드잖아요. 디 규콩도 저대도 가르쳐는 정주 심진 제바 손에 정주 심스대한데 질 동아 투모레 리디아다 근디 정주 심사 소 공부셔서디 nga lami ke logi tandam chanju sim wesa ki tangni phaji ti zondu sungya re sa da di shung di drabakyan se sa za shung di sungdu zo yu liu ni be chikje namnang sung shebe chikje ngobu tamcha tangjawa 풍부 감도 계시도 송전스 뭐 남자 셜다미 냠니베 라스선에 맞고 동반이 기능신 노사 까먹었잖아. 디 선도 주시리 다 디인저가 경영이야. 근데 인도 슝디기 외세 다 단도 외세가 조금입니다. 숭주 조금 디고 조승 거야. 자 근데 인도 산에 나 라미 투모 모임베 단담 창주 셈디 저시 준비가 인도 산에 창주 셈지 스트레샤.
The text that we are going to study is entitled Commentary on the Awakening Mind. And in terms of the scriptural sources of this particular text by Nagarjuna, there is the Sutra source and also the Vajrayana tantric source as well. But between these two, the primary source really is the Vajrayana tantric teachings. Therefore, although the term bodhichitta, the awakening mind, is used commonly both in the sutra teachings and in the Vajrayana teachings, here the term bodhichitta or the awakening mind has primarily the meaning according to the Vajrayana teachings, because the root text to which the Nagarjuna wrote this commentary is really 5 lines citation from the 2nd chapter of Guhyasamaja Tantra, where it is spoken in the words of Vajrayana, and therefore, so the text, when it bears the title Commentary on the Awakening Mind, here awakening mind really refers to the bodhichitta or the awakening mind understood according to the Vajrayana, particularly the highest yoga tantra, where awakening mind is understood in terms of the subtle clear light, ultimate clear light mind, both at the level of completion stage and particularly at the level of the union of clear light and illusory body. So that's the primary meaning of the term awakening mind here.
다음도 저디 뭐부터 당저와 시소게 한다 감방하고 되기 다 규칙직직디 지 타투도 취시타는 대당 연구도가 타투 선두저규 자 규리야 세규다 배규 니체 안드디 중국 규도 차샤나 세규직이야래 디 중국 가사 사운드의 규디 배규르지브리 배규리야 지 직직 다 다다 몽골 자야게 되지. 그래서 이 의미는 타주도 취시관에 자야送不래. 저도 선두 저주 찍了. 아니 시주 전부 주선님. 타용부 시비 규디 별 규야 말에. 맞아 시주 전부 주디. 시주도 아주 참 찾아는 규매이나. 맞아 시. 맞아 시주 주스 쏜 거야. 별 규셔도 시주 말에. 제니 다 저들이 인도 저주 직직들 나 먹고 자야 되지. 다 안데 고물루기 다 직지 또 될 자임도 색 단도 색 조림지 또 자임 거야. 단도 색 조림 샤인도 자네 그게다 가소리 직동 예미 사지 차디가 인도 자네 유유에서 동바티 유주에서 등예지로 리베이시 시대디 데 가서 유정거에서 니에 나네 안들디기 저 유주에서 때는 바용이야래.
So when we speak of commenting on the Vajrayana text, particularly the Tantras, there are, generally speaking, two main categories of Tantra, referred to as the explicit Tantras and hidden Tantras. So the explicit Tantras are like Kalachakra Tantra, but the hidden Tantras include, for example, Guhyasamaja Tantra, which is the source of this particular text by Nagarjuna. So in the hidden Tantra, like Guhyasamaja Tantra, the meaning of a particular, even a single term, can be interpreted in many different ways. For example, one uses the interpretive method of invoking, applying what is known as the 4 modes and the 6 boundaries, so within which a single term is interpreted in different ways at different levels. And here, for example, Guhyasamaja is the root source of this particular text, and Guhyasamaja Tantra, root Tantra, has 6 principal explanatory tantras, out of which 5 of them have been translated into Tibetan. So 5 of them are available, 1 was not translated. So, so here, when Nagarjuna is commenting on the bodhichitta, the awakening mind, he's commenting on bodhichitta at the level of not only Vajrayana, but also at the level of the completion stage, understanding of bodhichitta, awakening mind, in terms of the clear light mind at the level of completion stage. So, and here, so when we talk about the clear light mind on the completion stage, essentially we are talking about indivisible unity of awareness and emptiness. So here, we have 2 dimensions. One is the objective dimension, which is the object emptiness that is being experienced by the wisdom mind. The other one is the subject that is experiencing that emptiness, which is the subjective clear light. And between these two, the principal understanding of bodhicitta that is being brought in this text by Nagarjuna is the previous one, the first one, which is the objective emptiness or objective clear light.
도시원에 쉐베이나 너도 공지 나네 콜로를 무슨 숨도와 콜로 당부 den시 청고 콜로 바로바 스님의 배 청고 콜로 숨바 레번 나버치 청고를 전에 숨숨도와 전에 다 유디에서 다 den시 콜로 당부 den시 청고 되기 산제배 처기 좀실도 소인 거래. 바로 스님의 청고서야 돼 시식 중들이 이들이 유디에서 단 파버래. 다전에 너도 공제를 게 때문에 아니 레번 나버치 청고를 너도 공제도 아니 생이숨 차친다 랑 생이 두모도 차친 송구에 인도자네 레번 나버치와 송어레디 너도 지 콜로숨베 텔라 아니 하나 디시베 닝군 도스니 규라메 셰스자는 도시도가 다 전에 규라메 규라마다 가서다 규라메 셰스자는 도다 규라마 전에 디다 슝디기 슝산지 서버 슝산지 되기 또 유전에서 되는 법인 거예요. 저다가 라미기 다 저가 슝디디 대대보다 콜로 발백권의 송시에 동리되다 유지에서 되다 콜로 탐액권의 송시에 유진유에서 딘이부터 숭둔제니 탑시 예르메 집지 타네 애네 남주지 송도가 당가 겁네 디센드지 송이야.
So, so when we talk about the teachings of the objective clear light mind, we are essentially talking about the Buddha's teaching on emptiness, and which is presented in his various sermons. And from the point of view of the sutra, a system of teachings, for example, according to the Samdhi Nirmochana Sutra unraveling the intention of the Buddha, we identify 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma. The first turning is the Four Noble Teachings on the Four Noble Truths. The second turning primarily constituted by the teachings on the perfection of wisdom, Prajnaparamita Sutras. And in these two turnings of the wheel of Dharma, Buddha presents principally the objective clear light, which is the teachings on emptiness. And then the Samdindrimochana Sutra itself refers to the third turning of the wheel, which is referred to as the clear distinction of the various natures. And here, a subsection of the third turning of the wheel of Dharma includes sutras like Tathagata Garbha Sutra, the Essence of Buddhahood Sutra. And in these teachings, in addition to the objective clear light of emptiness, the Buddha also teaches the subjective clear light of the wisdom. And so what is unique about the Vajrayana teachings is that Vajrayana teachings presents a way in which the objective clear light, which is emptiness, and the subjective clear light of wisdom can be brought together into an indivisible union, and thereby presenting a path by which one can approach enlightenment through this indivisible union of the objective clear light emptiness and the subjective clear light wisdom.
tabshi sungri seni peshi sanjebe chu ji dan rodan chiri tabshi sungri sati da handa de nga gone gar sungor lo na tabshi sungdu redan di logic la tabshi 이게 내 상황지 tabshi ngo yerme shi che de.
So in generally the union of method and wisdom is a very essential part of the Buddhist path to enlightenment. And particularly in the Vajrayana context, the union between the method and wisdom is brought within into an indivisible union, where within a single event of the mental state, both the wisdom and method are present. So it is brought into an indivisible union.
Yeah. 다도 루주기 청주 섬지기 하나 선두저기 지도마 자유를 전에 뭐부 탐자 당자와 세야되기 산제베 쉐 마도베 지 응원다 다대 지다 가다지 떠루예베 추규 창말하게 소울 세야다 आत्मा से आची सुंगुदुआ और ती यानी 풍부 말에 된 신도 다 여대식 시기하래 और ती 산제베 달리야 타냐 근데 저거서는 뜻이랑 다 써야지 민다래 그 제주 참여래 아까다 뉴어메베 딱과 아니 풍부한다고 차샤는 도모 소화도 저도 도매를 싫어도 디멤버친 직부정시 딱직 아니 풍부를 직질 돼야 되지 차토로 싸야 되지 다스서는 그걸 때문에 랑자시 해야 되지 네 뜻이랑 신세 대대비 다 나바 탐지도 요 말이스 뭐부터 당자왔어 배는 뭐부터 탐지 당자왔을 전에 뭐부터 전에 만주 로리야 나 세야데 차서데 풍부한 사용도 와 나의 류드 셈니기 난도 하지네 나사로 셔도 와 된데기 강을 때는 나오냐 로 차르세 풍부가 대다 대라왕 교명이 풍불리 된신데 다 자원에 야말에 다 잘 뭐부터 당자왔어.
So the text begins with a citation from the root tantra of Guhyasamaja, where we read, devoid of all real entities. And the way in which Nagarjuna interprets that line is to really present the understanding that that in the Buddha's teaching, any notion of some kind of real entity that possesses an independent existence is rejected. So historically, there evolved many different philosophical schools of thought, and except for the Buddha's teaching, all ancient Indian schools of thought subscribe to some notion of an eternal principle, referred to as Atman, or some kind of eternal soul. And the characteristics of this eternal soul is understood to be unlike the aggregates, the body and mind, which is the basis of that self, which is multiple. The self is thought to be a unity, a single entity. And unlike the aggregates, which are impermanent, the self is thought to be permanent and eternal. And unlike the aggregates, which are dependent upon other forces, the self is thought to be independent. So a notion of an eternal principle that is unitary, eternal, and independent was postulated. So Nagarjuna reads the first line as rejecting this kind of eternal principle, both in relation to the self, but also in relation to the basis of that notion of self, which is our body and mind. Because generally, in our naive sense of our own self, when we think about the idea of I or me, and the notion arises as if coming from our body or coming within our mental processes. So Nagarjuna is pointing out that not only does this self, which is imputed, exist, but also the basis upon which the notion of self arises, which is our body and mind, these physical and mental aggregates, also are devoid of any independent existence.
Yeah. 풍부함 등 기시 중도 접은 남방바 사대기 랑데 좀 더 시승도가 당 좀더 시셔는 게 지라마 좀 더다 너데베 좀 더 얘기 강사가 담이 삼 직승구야래 최지 담이 승구야 말해 지자다 대니부터기 공도 가셔베 무디베 에는 좀더 다셔베 덕지랑 다 사디 야마레스 다음에 직수 대선도 마세베 에니 풍부 낭네 에니 풍부리 야완교겐 게다 랑자치 맞으러 시작도와 된제기 강사 랑자투와 된제지 나지 야마레스 어다 된제기 강사가 다음에 직수거야래 덕지랑 다 매베 다음에디 다음에 rakbare 강사 랑자투베 자유지 동에 다음에디 다음에 강사가 다음에 디루 다음에 차차돼야래 세상 어다 된제베 다음에 승거야래 다 풍급 계시기 최디기디 다도 줘래 가라 대버 줘래 풍급 계시기 최디기디에 너나 수전의 셰바 수신이 다 조 수신이로다 지 데미도 지르는데 여르데네 이 사실 패널스게 믿어와 다 안데 패널 여더버티 서와디도 셰기여 서와디도 럽도 셰바로 봐 서와디도 영향이 셰베 리디디 야 수전을 땡기도 봐 그래서 디니부디 안도다 개셔부셔도 와 그래서 디니도 전에 셰바 강로 댄세 수전기 풍부디디 초지 다 초참에서 다가 참이 뒤직 셰니 뒤진 참이 셰니 참이 디상을 락바 풍금지지 수전기 직샤 다 풍금지지기 셰베르디디 예 셰바기지 참이 그 균투네 아니 셰베균지 샤제 어디는 셰요래 그래서 된대기 애니 풍금지지 남샤직 샤샤바데 딱 강사 강의 때는 딱왜 시디 봐. 지 산지 최나리야 강사 세야디 풍불이 되시면 말이지 강사사의 풍부를 떼내 샤바레스. 전다 디송도와 다들서 강사 강은 떼내 다야의 시 풍부되기 다 언들데 수제 차샤는 저지 참네. 나셔바 차샤는 즈부 차샤는 기지 참네. 다 디지 사레 아니 송진이 샤베 말이. 다 진짜지 다 최지다면 말에 아니 좀 더 고마 좀 더 리아 좀더 니샤베 넘릭바도 우모벌 니샤베 다 넘릭베 가르친 거잖아 된대기 전도 얘기 아니 송진 참이 샤야지 송진지 참이 디싹베 아니 송어 라과다 다 송어도 즈바 디 참이 좀시 참이 싸네 다 샤샤버디 야 말이스 아니 다단 저조 디입니다 가서 주디 송어디 송어 뒤 철을 받도 보이나요 그 차셰 체야 예버지마도 차셰 매배 참이 자원의 야 말이스 근데 인도산에 파파파파 자리에는 니 송의 처 강이나요 자는 야 말이스 유영은에 주버지 시샤체 유영은에 주버지 시샤체니 아니 봐 자연도 많이 보인도잖아요 다 매발 다 잡으리 근데 인도 아니 송어 치르서도 주요 말이스 송어 치르서도 주버도 능게 열때 나와도 주요 말이스 치든가 근데 치든가에 담에 시행 거예요 다 치든가 인도잖아요 다 치든 캐용도 다 안 수로로 서버 쇼디리 여러분다 녀미도 능도 자 딜레인드스는 다 녀미도 나 수제 쇼디리 가르스름나 런진 셰바티 때문에 바샤사도 나래 마도 거라 치료 단도 주버지 말이스 어제네 다 도세네 송지 니지 돈에 다면 취다면 시야이 말이
And then when read the lines 2 and 3, which reads, utterly discarding all objects and subjects, such as aggregates, elements, and sense fields. Here, Nagarjuna is first referring to the philosophical views of the first two classical Buddhist schools, Vaibhashika and Sautrantika. Both of these non-Mahayana classical Indian schools, Buddhist schools, accept the Buddha's teaching on no self and reject the notion of Atman, that is unitary, unchanging, and independent as postulated before. And on top of that, they also reject the notion of any kind of self that is the owner of our body and mind. You know, in our naive perception of self, we have a feeling that over and above our physical and mental processes, there is someone or something called me that somehow owns this, to whom these physical and mental processes belong, that which is somehow independent of these bases. So this kind of a notion of self is also rejected. So according to these two schools, the Buddha's teaching on no self is understood in terms of the absence of a self-sufficient and independent self. So, however, these two schools do accept that when it comes to the basis of the notion of self, which are the physical and mental processes, these are unlike the self. They possess real existence. Whether it is physical or mental processes, they possess real existence. And these real existence can be grounded in understanding their deeper reality. So, for example, in the case of, now here, we're primarily talking about mental processes and physical phenomena, because these are the two domains that have direct bearing on our experience of happiness and suffering. You know, when we talk about happiness and suffering, which is our main concern as sentient beings, we are talking about subjective experiences, which are mental and psychological processes, and these which are seen as the ultimate constituents of matter, which then, through greater aggregation give rise to the macroscopic level of physical world that we experience. And similarly, when it comes to consciousness, the mental realm, they understand the existence of consciousness in terms of their ultimate constituents as being indivisible units of cognition, kind of moments of cognition, which through aggregation creates this continuum that we experience as conscious experience. So, and this is how Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, the two classical Indian schools out of the four, the non-Mahayana schools, account for our reality. Of course, this understanding of reality is then rejected and critiqued by the Mahayana schools, the first of which is the consciousness-only school, which is Vijnana Matra, or mind-only. And according to the mind-only school, they take issue with the notion that the physical reality is constituted or made up by indivisible elements, elementary particles. So according to mind-only school, the argument is that no matter how minute you take this dissection of matter to any level, so long as it remains matter, material, it must have some notion of parts, because without any sense of directional location, the whole notion of matter breaks down. So therefore, if you analyze in this way, the notion of indivisible elementary particle just does not, becomes untenable. Therefore, they reject this attempt to understand the nature of reality in this reductive manner and building up from this indivisible elementary particle. So therefore, Chittamatra, the mind-only school, rejects even the physical reality that we experience. Then the question arises now, given that we do experience the physical world, we see flowers, we see vases, and so on, then, how can we, what are they made of? And the mind-only school's understanding is that these are, in fact, extensions of our own perception, which results from habitual propensities that we create in our mind, which then appear as a projection out there, as if there is an external physical reality. So in this way, the mind-only school critiqued the view of reality of Vaibhashika and Sautrantika.
Tadi 풍국함도 지지기 수어 방법스럽네 르토야스도와 수어 방법 직세 다드네 짐바 다 덴주식도와 짐바런시 주부터 시기하러 다다 짐바랑은 주지 자 다디 우마베 슝국걸이 알레윤데 수어 다 담벌매번시 짐바야 담벌매버레스 Samzamba Kyojulula, any Chidun Kanaya, Zimbat Dindu Debe Indusane, any Zimbe Chardobe, Dawad Tunge, Saw Didu Satella, the Chatan, Guaya, Tapshi Kartua says, young Sarvati. Satiri Indusane, Zimbat Dindu Gurgiorta, Sumzi Nigalo. Chazan Chella Dame Yamni, Ransom Sena Makiba, Suzanne. Zimba non sheba deyang any chashel dene da do the is Jenny oda sheba deyang damanine any damanine magiba ngoni magiba rawang majuba that sheyari the umabendo shebe 아서 선에 맞아 동원이지라 신동. 어디 되게 제 시징이 되나 소나 신기 최탐제 원이 주변 동아래. 당연히 코알로 코약. 그다 싸워르디 나 땡주도 좀 되가나 토이고도. 나 땡버지 텔은 직대민다. 최지 당지 강사가 당지 얘기나네 강사가 당지 나네 강사신 담버 주원 좀 정도 봐세베 단 짐바다 릉니 된두도 집은 니에바나네 강을 때는 나오냐 차세 나테 된두도 집었더라 직접서도 집에 시지 풍부 사과를 미네 나오냐도 집에 나와 있잖아요 집을 직서로 나왔어 시도와 다디 때는 나중에 쓰면 난그 싸울 때 네가 머리부터 담고 네가 내고 가사가 시대 다 가사 봐봐도 상당히 되잖아요 자외 가사가 덕실이 셰베 규를 때는 딱 봐야 되잖아요 셰바 때문에 되는 봐야 돼 셰바 코랑 게 정신 대동 대래 다 상당히 싸울 토요 아주 종아가凶呢 질소 대동 상당히 연구를 집어대도 상당히 연구를 조조대 집어대도가 상당히야 대낭전에 셰바 차라 chen 셰바 참여 관계 동리 단어 봐야 돼 조성도 상대나 배나다 고불루주기 세기 도 아다 아리안데 루주그 자셰베 지면 제바 주두 나리야 심지신이 단어 보고야 돼 조셔 송도와 산된 제제 저서 차진도 자진 걸리네 조 심지신이 단어 봐야 돼 조셔게 하래 저들이 메인잖아요 시베 자오 심지 제베를 숨겨로 봐 저들이 시베 자오 생 심코라 당연히 나는 뒤도 제법 뒤도 영업도 다 돼. 다 살 봐봐 싸움 다 있나? 시베 길을 때는 다 보이 버리. 근데 이제는 시바코랑 단동대 시바코랑 그 직세 싸움다 다지 조쳐도 와. 저들이 이미지는 안 돼. 랑스 선에 맞죠. 랑 셈스는 뭐 시스템서 그거라. 다 간다 가서 셈딩 그 돈이 있다는 봐야 돼. 나 돈을 셈드 속이야. 어디 뒤송샤. 랑스 선에 맞이봐. 동문이지를 신도.
Then we read the remaining lines from the root tantra, which reads, due to sameness of selflessness of all phenomena, one's mind is primordially unborn. It is the nature of emptiness. So here, Nagarjuna is presenting the final view, which is according to the Madhyamaka, a middle way school, where they reject the perspective of the mind-only school, because mind-only school, through their analysis, although rejected the intrinsic existence of external world of matter, but they accept that the internal world of subjective experience or consciousness possess real existence, has some kind of independent intrinsic existence. So what Nagarjuna is saying is that just as the external world of matter becomes unsustainable, untenable, when you subject it to analysis and seek for their, ultimate constitutive elements and ground its reality in that way. In the same manner, if you take consciousness or mind again and we apply the same analysis, we will not be able to find kind of, a real existence or intrinsic existence of even consciousness as well. So therefore, and furthermore, one problem with grounding the notion of consciousness in some kind of intrinsic existence is that, then there is no a real antidote to deal with attachment related to one's own experience. Through rejecting the reality of the external world, one may be able to prevent attachment towards external objects, but if you kind of reify your internal experience, then there is no antidote to counter the attachment and grasping that might arise with respect to the internal world of experience. Therefore, Nagarjuna's teaching presents a negation of not just the independent existence of true existence of external world of matter, but also the internal world of experience as well. So in this way, the teaching of emptiness is presented right across the entire spectrum of reality. And in fact, the teaching of emptiness across the entire spectrum of reality is the main subject matter of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, these teachings. And all of this points out that the root of our unenlightened existence, samsara, is really this grasping a true existence of all phenomena, and particularly a true existence of one's own self, on the basis of this innate notion of I am, me. And so therefore, in the Buddhist text, we speak of grasping at the true existence of the person and grasping at true existence of phenomena. And between these two, the grasping at true existence of the person is more fundamental cause of our samsaric existence, and particularly here, not just grasping at some other person, but rather grasping at the true existence of your own sense of me, I. And this is referred to as the egoistic grasping, grasping at one's own sense of I. And in fact, this is the first link in the chain of 12 links of dependent origination, where we identify ignorance, fundamental ignorance, to be the first link in that chain. And so, therefore, it becomes very important for the spiritual aspirant to understand the emptiness of the person. And in this course, what becomes important is to also have understanding of emptiness of the consciousness itself. Because when we talk about the notion of sense of self or person, the person or self is designated on the basis of physical and mental aggregates, the processes, and within this, it is really the mental continuum which serves as the primary basis for our notion of self and person. Therefore, understanding the nature of consciousness becomes very crucial. And particularly if you look at the highest yoga tantric teachings, these teachings really emphasize meditation on the emptiness of mind, because emptiness of mind, understanding the nature of mind, becomes crucial for understanding emptiness. And in the Vajrayana teachings, there is a recognition of different levels of subtlety of consciousness, the grosser level, subtle level, extremely subtle levels of consciousness. And when one meditates upon the nature of mind, it is done so in terms of invoking a subtle level of consciousness and meditating upon its emptiness. For example, in Aryadeva, who was the disciple of Nagarjuna, in his commentary on Nagarjuna's 5 stages, called the Compendium of Training or Compendium of Deeds, there Aryadeva presents the teaching on emptiness primarily on the basis of meditation on the emptiness of mind, the nature of mind. This is because mind is the basis of the notion of self, and self is the subject that experiences the results of karma. It is the self that is the agent of an action, and therefore, in order to truly negate grasping at this self, one also needs to negate the grasping at the consciousness, which is the basis of that notion of self and person.
Sanje Jumden Namdang, Chanju Saba Chubu Tedam Ki, Sheso Digi, Guzu Chanju Sem Pomia, Tiswing.
So then the text reads, after that, just as the blessed Buddhas and the great bodhisattvas have generated the mind of great awakening and so on, so from that point onwards, then Nagarjuna presents the conventional bodhichitta, the meditation on the conventional awakening mind.
이게 최저다 좀바 담자도 송차래 제라 셜로가 니베 제다 셜로가 니베들이 셜로가 니베들라 뒤도봐 상제남지 창주심 다도 풍소 능력이 똑바르게 멋지바 신 송야디 상제남지 아니 털도 공부 단담 창주 생기 유동번이데 아니 다당 풍소 넘리기 똑바르기 멋지바 써야 되기 모두베 다도 따외 똑바 잘못 된 얘기 가서 그게 풍소 된주도 준비 된적이 똑바 되네 넘리베 아니 낭즈바 된주도 도바 대남지 뭐지바 하나 송진기 최 탐제 아니 정신이 동에 동반이 돼 아니 산제의 신주선반 남기 말에 또 산제 남기 장주성 가서 우리 그게 터두디 아니 최 탐제 정신이 동에 동이 돼서 시기가 해 소입니다 이슈데 쇼로가 숨버되기 닝지 렘베 셈지니 배배 공부를 차와인스 된대기 돈이 떡별로 대장식 단어를 줬으면 차이야 말이 돈이 무슨도 떡배 돈이는 니난 너베 돈이 무슨도 떡배 믿어 이시지 차샤나야 대장기 단어를 줬으면 차이야 말이 단담 장주었으면 차발라 돈이 무슨도 떡별로 되니 탑 장주었으면 있으면 좋고요 아니 단어를 장주었으면 차이야 근데 이 말이잖아요 닝지 렘베 셈지니 배배 공부를 차와인스 투지 등이 산제기 장주선도 따도 또 대대별 이 장주선 단도 장주선 대 아니 가서 냠신자를 소하다.
So then when Nagarjuna in his own words comments on the Buddha's teaching on awakening mind in the stanza 1 he makes the salutation to the Buddha and then in stanza 2 he actually makes the presentation and here it reads the Buddhas maintain the awakening mind to be not obscured by such conceptions as self aggregates consciousness and so on. It is always characterized by emptiness. So here what Nagarjuna is presenting is that the awakening mind, which is here the ultimate awakening mind, which is a direct realization of emptiness, is such that it is devoid of any conceptions of notion of self. Here he is negating the non-Buddhist notion of Atman. And then when he talks about conceptions of aggregates, here he is negating the Buddhist schools such as Vaibhashika and Sotrantika, who present the notion of the real existence of aggregates. And the notion, when he says that it is devoid of the conception of consciousness, here he is negating the position of the mind-only school, and then says that the true nature of this bodhichitta is really emptiness. And then, however, this realization of emptiness alone does not become ultimate awakening mind, does not become bodhichitta. Therefore, he writes in the next stanza, which is stanza 3, he says that it is with the mind moistened by compassion that you must cultivate the awakening mind with effort. So the point being made here is that the ultimate awakening mind is a direct realization of emptiness, which is complemented or reinforced by bodhicitta, the awakening, altruistic awakening mind. So therefore he writes, the Buddhas who embody great compassion constantly develop this awakening mind.
Oh yeah. That dene shologa shivanema mudibun dewa kagotere.
So then from stanza 4 onwards, Nagarjuna is presenting the critique of the non-Buddhist views.
That 대양 말하는 로 행길이야. 아주 로를 쉬어도 와. 하나 로 개베 그도기 풍부디 그 중치배 걸이야. 뒤에 삼바치 정민도 와. 그 갈래갈래 풍부야. 개치 친데지. 아주 로를 쉬어도 와. 다른 신기 변화 다대 지금 다 냠용 싸대 봐. 지금 로중 제시배 시바디 중치배 걸의 여삼바지에 배지 정민도 와. 그 리스민 이부디 도슨 요두기 되지. 아주 로를 쉬어야 와. 다이네 나 슬자네 나 깨베 그도네 전에 나 찍을지로 쉬어도 자상가 리스민 이부디 두매랑 신속도 무슨 요원도 돼야지 나 슬도 찍 타만에 마 예대로 찍으러 쉬어도 뒤찍체 니네 리스민 이슬도 나한테 롱자자 나서야지 리스민이 더기를 송에 롱 접어보 저로 쉬어도 자상가 저도 롱저버부터 아니 즉 전남 지금 방대비 any long jajala, pa dancing maris, two tempomato. So the day round the Lord Sheldo. So the day into Zane, any detail, she going to tang it in the Yungu into Zane, listen you would take Kagarita, the Lundi, Sangame Luda, Sendi Luba, Kagaimata, Sydney, she said. So that Shivas Lune, Ludil Tembe, Shiva Chinese and a Page Kagar, Tondi. But the day by the Shiva Taman of such Mashana, Kaudoa. So the day by the Zaneta, Naman and Drome, Dinner Chimandong, Daj Yogo, that Pumbul, never meeting, a Pumbul, Shembe Daj Kudos, Duji to going. So, Maji, Yere Duji, but a Mig, Sukton in the Zane, Mig Tonso Samas Lord Mitimba, Lord Michawa. Lolly, mere tongue some of Lord Shagdo. Mixo di tongue corpse. Tongue moment, Massiatic tongue, as Lord Henry Shagdo. Or the Tushi did it on a Pumbul attention, but I are so what day.
So, if you kind of think more deeply about the basis of the non-Buddhist views about the notion of self, in fact, we can relate to our own personal experience when we examine the way in which we, in our naive kind of understanding, the way in which we perceive our own existence as individuals and as self, we know that if we think about our own continued existence with relation to body, we intuitively or have a notion that body ages. For example, if you are already grown up or a certain age in your point in your life, you don't have the feeling that this body is the same body that I had when I was a kid. So you do kind of naturally accept the aging process of your body. Similarly, with relation to the mind, if you think about the current state of your mind, which has already benefited from long experience of going through formal education and so on, again here, we don't feel that this, the mature mind that I have is the same mind that I had when I was a kid. So with relation to body and mind, we have a sense that it is continuous, it is, multiple and so on. So, however, when we relate to our own notion of self, it seems to be quite different. When we think about ourselves, we immediately, for example, if we try to recall our experience from a very early childhood, you say, when I was at that time. So we use the same term I and extend it across this span of time and assume as if there is this one individual that passed through this temporal passage. So unlike body and mind, when it comes to the notion of self, we have this notion of a unity. We feel there is only one thing. So therefore, we can understand why philosophers would attribute this oneness or unity to the characteristic of self. Similarly, when we observe our body and mind, we can feel that this body is mine, and this, I have this thought and emotions and so on. So we feel as if, over and above our body and mental processes, there is someone or something called me or self that is the owner of, or that is the bearer of these experiences, that is the owner that somehow to whom these kind of processes belong to. And so we feel that since this self or the person is the owner or controller of these processes depend upon the self, but not vice versa. The self is somehow independent of this. So in this in this way, we can see that the philosophical idea of self as a unitary, unchanging, and independent can be how these kind of philosophical views arises. Similarly, these non-Buddhist schools argue that there must be something called self, because when you see something with your eyes, instinctively you do not feel that my eye sees this thing, but rather instinctively the thought arises, I see this thing. So therefore, we have a sense that somehow our senses are like doors or avenues through which we experience the world. And there is something called self that, engages with the world through these doors, which are the senses. So it's for these kind of reasons, non-Buddhist classical Indian schools postulate a notion of an eternal, independent self.
Sholoka Shibadigi, Mudi Jenny Kangdawa, Dada Ribian Namjana, Punang Gunji Nanam, Kanshin, Niemain, the Shasama Sumche. The issue de Sholoka Gubadigi, Kadding Murni, Kaddi that the Kanshi pageant, Dechasu, Kanshi, Murni, Damindi, Murnam Dado, Gejishir, Kanshi Medan Mobola, Chabaponi Kawame, Sadigi. Da Dindegi, any. Dagzirang da ji, any shaba ina, da de yuamere. Any pungbu yu the dene, da and yu, of the shago, Tanya. My shinutula, not gavutula, none never gavus, shadua. But that dish is an mate pungula. Dene, you have a self shadow. Pungu Turgula dene, not Turgushaya. Pungu Ganshuna dene, not Ganshaya. A Pungu Demaditone, not Demadishaya. But Masia, Pungu tension by Yanga Shimbaina, Lu nowadays, not now, and Tanya Shashima, the shadow. So the river is a young answer, not Sameton, sometime in Masia. Pungu, listen, you should dead, which is 7 to 1. So the day is an Sanje Carson Lona, Masia de Pungule, Pungula Dene, Shares, Pungula Dene, that was. She's a son Sasson and she got a Pungula Dene, my showers. The day in the Pungula Demege, Maranja, Yamaris. Nga Medawaji Shai, Pung, Nga Kanga, Danish, Dase, Pungudi, Medawari, tell it then a tagbe, Nadia, Medawari, the Indu, Dugzirang, dark kegbe, any Chevapo Kea Yomaris, Medawer, Dagbe Chevapo Kebare Mado, Medawer, and she be Chevapo Kea Yomaris, not Shudi. Kanjin Muni, Dam Mindi, Muno Datu Gizis, Kanjin Medan, Mobola, Chevapo Yakaba, long Java, long Jaja, Pungso, Didi, Shadow rays.
So, as mentioned earlier, from verse 4, Nagarjuna is critiquing the non-Buddhist school's view of self. And then in verse 9, we read, if it were an entity, it would not be permanent, for entities are always momentary. And with respect to impermanent entities, agency has not been negated. So what Nagarjuna is stating here in the concluding verse in this particular section is that, if, as non-Buddhist schools postulate, self is eternal, unchanging, and independent, then how can, the relationship between this self, which is supposedly unchanging, and the aggregates, the physical and the mental elements, which are constantly changing, how can the relationship between the two be accounted for? Because Nagarjuna argues that just as the body and mind goes through a process of change, therefore self, or the notion of person that is designated upon the body and mind, too must undergo change. And in fact, according to Nagarjuna, he argues that if we carefully examine the way in which the notion of self operates in us, there is a recognition of this. For example, when we talk about, when I was young, when I was old, when I was sick, and when I was happy, and so on, unhappy. So here, what is happening is that the attributes of the physical and mental states, whether they belong to, whether they were young or old or sick or well, all of these attributes are also attributed becomes attributes of the person, the self that is being designated. So therefore, Nagarjuna explains that if the self, on the other hand, is completely independent, then how can this independent self interact with the physical and mental processes that together make up the existence of this individual? So therefore, what the Buddhist teaching explains is that the reality of self, the existence of self and person, can only be understood in terms of something that is contingent, something that is dependent upon the physical and mental aggregates, mental processes. Therefore, just as the physical and the mental aggregates are impermanent, the self or the person that is designated upon these processes too are impermanent. And then Nagarjuna explains that, however, having rejected this eternal self that is independent, that does not, by implication, also negate the existence of the person, existence of some kind of agency. So that's why he writes that, and with respect to impermanent entities, agency has not been negated. So he's saying that although self as an agent that is independent has been negated, one can still maintain the notion of an agency or a person that is impermanent.
다 되네마. 다소 제 직된디 다 쇼로가 주버시. 쇼로가 주버는마 뜻이라면 다 야마레스. 다 소소도 되게 다다 가사다 셰리게다 가사 주고 소다 강사사 든지디 얘네 풍불이 된 신배 든지 야마레스. 다소 저기 풍복함도 지 송질로 인정만 주스 풍급 계시기 최 랑생이 주고 샤샤바 대 뭐다 태양 뭐 십두잖아 아니 로이 점바티 리베 너무레스 제니다 담아대니인데 바디 까용 거야래 제니다 풍속의 최상물로 아니 네更你 차게 다도야 숨이 오었던잖아 초추이 주본의 시소 송니 아니 소소의 최디디 상물로 아니 가시 우리 그게 두번도 무슨 거야 레사지 다디 샴데 디르샤 저는 다디디 디샴 샴데 쇼로가 와다디 쇼로가 쇼로가 니슈적지 니소에 쇼로가 니슈적지디 순던 짐베 모이 남시 나와 강연바 남시 레네 타데바 치유되는 가양 메시지 다 송진기 소소 샤용 거야래 소도 짐바 타데바 쇼로 샤용 거야래 야고지 상담바이나 소 치유되는 뭐저버리 다 되게 슬로다들이 셰베 당니도 야래 소도 셰바 다 자타데 동래 세니 다 넘지게 다와 디셴니 담아디니기 가서 우리 그게 직송을 된두샤샤 다 송어 참이 싸네 송어 둘때부터 가요 거야 되가버다.
So then from verse 10 we read, this world devoid of self and so on is utterly vanquished by the notions of aggregates, elements, and the sense fields, and that of object and subject. So here, self and so on includes all the characteristics that are generally used to, sort of the terms that are used to refer to the individual or the person. So the person, the individual, the being, and so on. And so Nagarjuna, having negated the notion of self and Atman, then goes on to negate the views of the Buddhist schools as explained before. Here, particularly the real existence of aggregates, elements, and so on. So this section of the text goes on up to verse 22.
21.
Now, the So in the version that has been imprinted here, there is one extra stanza, which is stanza number 16. So when His Holiness says 21, ours is 22. So
under day you deve Jurugudi Sudu Wanshi came in the Tene Wambulade, do you say Shiso Chikche?
Di Gande Dido Sudu Leshen Wangbo Mes Sudu Leshen Wangbo Me Chebu Wangbo Shindume Kebabo the Kebata Yanda Keba Rigmais. Taramsalan Ladola Parjabus Dinam Kavan.
Shan cousin Eddie, cousin the India, the Devra, Mitin Javati. Did the Chilamado, Chilamado, did Alano dams too. Did then you run out?
The version that His Holiness is using is from the Tengur and Derke edition, and when he compared it against Smith Janakriti's commentary of this text, it seems to go really well with the root text in Tengur. So the version one here has an extra stanza. So in verse 22 of our version, it reads, in terms of objects and subjects, whatever appears to the consciousness apart from cognitions themselves, no external object exists anywhere. So what Nagarjuna is presenting the critique of the view of reality of classical Indian Buddhist schools, the realist schools, Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, from the point of view of the mind-only school. And then, therefore, he writes that apart from the cognitions themselves, no external objects exist anywhere.
Yeah. That in Jenny, I shall organize the she. Some Shologan is the she, Dardons, but dog Pumbu comes or Deba in she. Dugji Ran, Da Pumbula Tension by Yamari, Da said the Pumbula Dene Shapasamre, Susan, Da Pungso Chedi, Ransan to a she, Shisha, Sungsha she. So Dardons, but dog Pumbu comes or Deba in this one. Semsambol and then Gazin of the Tang Bunks. That dinner to the coma, Semsabeta, Tumdalia, Shune, Semsabet to the Tone, the little Zibatin to the cake, Zibatin to Mari, Zibatin to Mari, Zibatin to Mari, the Swatin to the car, cake, car. So, number ship of Mawala, then you sang it, number ship of Mawala, not only the Semsu to Shenny. That did Hamjalo, 70 tiny race, that's Dinama Shenny, and it. That's something they were distinguished. That's also some dendru. That dendru share in the Zane, that's something where Shung does not all, Bena Choland, Chadag, Shung to the Same Shung, so Chadayare, something where Rangri, Duyumdua, catch up with Jini. Karasama, Shaja, Drubati, Jaji Tane, Jaji Rale. Jeji Seme Drubiati, Rangik Tane, Drubiachi, Sonua. So the Lindu Zane, Semen of Shah in the Zane, Shenri the Rangisa, Nichin, Diguaneta, Sundua. So that the Limbe in the Zane, Ada, Namshi so soon. And the Namshi Druji, Samadi Shah in the Rangit Shah, that those two yare. Jenny, yeah, this little.
So then in verse 25, we read that to overcome grasping at selfhood, the Buddha taught aggregates, elements, and so on. And by abiding in the state of mind only, the beings of great fortune even renounced that teaching. So what is being presented here is a progressive development of the view, so that you, in the first stage, you reject the non-Buddhist notion of selfhood, and then, accept the reality of aggregates and so on, and then from the perspective of the mind-only teachings, that you negate even the real existence of these aggregates as well. And then from verse 26 we read, for those who propound consciousness only, this manifold world is established as mind. What might be the nature of that consciousness? I shall now explain this very point. So, from this point onwards, Nagarjuna is presenting the mind-only school's understanding of the nature of reality. So in mind-only school, having rejected the real existence of external world of matter, they accept the true existence of consciousness, and therefore in this particular school, understanding the reality of the consciousness becomes very crucial, and it is in this particular school many great masters of the Buddhist epistemological tradition, such as Dignaga and Dharmakirti, belong to. And if you look at Dignaga and Dharmakirti's writing, the whole epistemological system is built upon making a distinction between perceptions of the external world versus a perception or self-cognizing awareness. And so since the reality of the external world or the validity of our perception is grounded in the validity of the perceptions themselves, the validity of the perceptions are then grounded in a quality that is attributed to these perceptions, which is a self-cognizing faculty. And in this way, the reality of consciousness or mind is established in this school.
Yeah. So that Umabedas for sensible Paka in the Chane, that Dinama under the Bena Nisturuti. The datum is sense of Tibet temple comes at the Chiban of the Japan and Banaching, Tinimin, do the such order, do the longer the machine, do the such way and long day, Kasurpige, Hasach, simulation with Chibobo. Go out and all send some somebody at the Louis. That longer ship and get sick already. Children are you in the Satin or the Rigi, that Dodden, Yorita, Chirukash of the day. The Zut had the Gabawang song is to be temper considered the Chivan and the Japan and Banaching, Tinimin, Do Penando to consider Vinala, any Shawan, Dendrusum. Cousin began to get shed at the this average story. Yandamo in Gundo, Uti Chikti, Jebadan Aloli, Ying Zeshab, Jebadan Alolia, Casa Yandamo be Shawa, Yang Azota, Matabe Shawa the share. Yandamo said the Matabe Shawa the share, Yandamo, Matabe Shawa, Gundo di Yus. Citizen, you said the Ying Jebenalia, Ranshin Shepherd, Sig Hamo, said. You said Tanya to Yavazon, Maris, Ranshin Yavadi, Seni, Ying Jebena, Sondua, the Savishua, Tajadua. Jazanga, Yandama, Gundo, telling you Yamai, Dombany in the Dilly, telling the Tayo Sen, the Sunshine, that much English, my Bangla wasn't done, that didn't go out of shot. And then you would be Madawe Shawai, Ransin, doing Sundua. Shivarang Jewish. Oh, just as the Kunlia, any lung to Jesus Gurney. The Dodgy lung to Gurney, Guyardi, Umabe Delpal, that land you something they soon your maris manager, something they soon your native Gabawang song is, that is Guyardi.
So then in verse stanza 27, we read, all of this is but one's mind. That which was stated by the able one is to elevate the fear of the childish. It is not a statement of final truth. So here Nagarjuna is critiquing the mind-only school's view. And so of course in the Buddha's sutras, such as the 10 levels sutra Dashabhumika, although which has different interpretation, and also in Langa Avatara, and Descent to Langa Sutra, there are statements which explicitly reject the reality of the external world and establishes the truth of mind only. So similarly, if you look at Vasubandhu's commentary on, differentiation of the middle and the extremes, which is in Maitriya's text, there is a particular stanza where Vasubandhu, when he explains, comments upon this, he explicitly states that the statement which says that the thought processes that are deluded, distorted, do exist, and he says that it's not merely a matter of existence, but also the notion of existence is intrinsic existence. So the point is that in Vasubandhu's writing, it is very clearly stated that according to mind-only school, consciousness and the cognitions and the mental processes do possess real intrinsic existence. And so in Nagarjuna and Madhyamaka, when they critique the mind-only school, they do not do so by saying that the Buddha never taught the mind-only. The critique is, yes, the Buddha taught this teaching in the various sutras, such as also in the Samtinirmochana Sutra, which is the sutra unraveling the intention of the Buddha, where the teaching on emptiness is explained in terms of contextualizing different meanings of emptiness. So the Nagarjuna says that it's not that Buddha did not teach mind only, but he's saying that these teachings that the Buddha gave do not represent the final truth. They were taught for a specific purpose. Therefore, he writes, it is to elevate the fear of the childish, and it is not a statement of final truth.
Teaching Gaia Daniel, Churla Dami, Yabani, 70 Derman, 70 Derman, Magedi, Sanjay and Dutusums. Nang Ziba Semdean, Damanine, Rashi Modures and Songares.
So then in stanza 29, Nagarjuna writes that the Buddha has taught that even the mind too is emptiness. So therefore he writes, to those who delight in the great vehicle, the Buddha taught in brief, selfless in perfect equanimity, and that the mind is primordially unborn.
That Rama Pashi Timra, Kunshi. That Lungajan Samzabe, Kansag, Senshi Shai Nusane, Kunshinam Shai Shigger, Shiva Lungadan Shang. Kandachi, Semi Negamongu Yava Indusane, the Guanyum, Semi Negative Yava Indus, the Negul in the Kansa Mabachado, some Kora. 이 시바디 강사를 샤바이나 강사 선실을 샤바이나 그래서 이제 인도산에다 내가 그뒤에 다고 요대하러 지기 근시담을 샤바서야지 샤인거래 저 어디 딩과야 송샤 배진스레 다 나가는 신기 정리디 송용거래 다 딩과야 송샤 다 쇼데 런루기 한데 딘다 숨주 소주고 숨주 말에 숨주 섭제버들이셔. 숨주 섭제버디 다 백숨 쏘고디. 숨주 쏘고디 셰베 시저도 버디 셰자 매버 셰바메. 대단하니 릭지다. 릭지 매지 면도스. 다 어디기 단단님부터 뒤송이었으래. 자제 레슨데 요래스. 자제 레슨 때베 거네 요래스. 다가는 신기 아니 세좀 줘야 돼. 아니 샤자라 때네 제지 참아라 때네 샤자 편주 때네 저리스 다디 우무주고디 해지 주고라는데 식세는 해지 세우시 송도가 받아 들이샤 편주 때네 저버지 셰디산에 샤자다 제지 세야디 편주 때네 저리스 저는 어디 런루기 뒤송이 하래 샤자 제지 참 샤자 두지 참아체 참아 두지 런리게 셰모
Then from stanza 30, Nagarjuna is critiquing a principal tenet of the mind-only school, which is the notion of alaya, the foundational consciousness. And the reason for postulating this notion of alaya or foundational consciousness is to really search for the true identity of the person. And since there are many mindless states of existence, such as when one is fainting and when one is in deep cessation and so on, the mind-only school maintains that there must be an eighth consciousness which retains its continuity, and therefore, because if we take the continuum of consciousness to be the basis of the personal existence, then in states of unconsciousness, when there are no conscious experience, then there will be no person. The continuity of the person will be broken. So this is the reason why mind-only school postulates the notion of alaya, foundational consciousness. So this notion is being negated by Nagarjuna. Similarly, the notion of self-cognizing awareness, which is this perceptive attribute of consciousness, this is also negated. Then finally in stanza 39, Nagarjuna writes, the cognizer perceives the cognizable. Without the cognizable, there is no cognition. Therefore, why do you not admit that neither object nor subject exist at all? So what Nagarjuna is stating here is that when we have notions such as the object and subject, cognizer and the cognized object, these are concepts that are that arises on the basis of mutual relationship. It is not the case that the perception verifies the object, and the perception itself is verified by a third kind of factor, which is the self-cognizing awareness. Therefore, Nagarjuna is saying that just as in the case of agency, act, and the object of action, all these three elements of an action are mutually dependent and mutually defined. In the same manner, cognition and the cognized object are mutually defined. One cannot define one without the other. So through mutual dependence, one can maintain these notions. So this is what Nagarjuna is presenting here in stanza 39. And this notion of mutual dependence is very clearly presented in Chandrakirti's commentary on Mula Madhyamaka Karika, which is the clear words.
동리 런신 두주에 근시 첩을 마와 민스 되는 딱반이도야 의심해 보면 없어야 되기 다 동반이 셔셔버 되기 딱저게 탄이 쓰기 어레스 동리 런신 두주에 써야 되기 최전의 주주디 되는 주버레샤스 되는 주버 인상 런신이 동어레스 러브윤도 런신이 동어인데 최전의 런신도 주대 런신도 셔되고 봐 선 시직 여연이 런시 동거를 쓰기 어려워도 가야 매번 런시 동거를 쓰고 말아. 저들이 인도 셔들홍이야 말이지. 때는 매 쓰고 말이지. 때는 매번이나 시직이 땡기 개주 춘이 슬럽신 말아. 고 다음에 때면 알아. 다음에디 동리 런시 두주에 근시 찹을 마음이지. 동시 시전 여식도. 동번이 단당 어머니 자시로 나서 오는 시리 땡진 저번 중앙가 되는 동반이도 셰신 땡진 저번 중앙 강인 버태 아니 런시 동배 다래 신 수윤도 그 지기 예당 그 샤나 라는 예배 인상 샤나 라마레베 런신지 동래 신 수윤도 그 동배 거와 야우차베이나 예배지 거이고 저들이 이미 전에 거시 샤버 마음 민스 되는 딱반이도야 거시마 보면 이노스 다 선잠배 东西向往，跟那个东北东里永住的，将你向往的永住你不的定住些个，是吧？是吧？但定的没有吧？东北你的定的下过来，定的没有啥呢？东北你送过多啊，是的，这没有啥呢？看到呢，告诉嘞，这一边呢，东你定住要嘛的是。 가다 런시 동반이 있잖아. 동반시에 있잖아. 땅바로 마요. 말해. 동반이 딘루도 되봐요. 말해. 딘루이 뭐 있잖아. 아니 예미게 탄이도 차와래. 서지송이 그래.
Then in stanza 58, which is on page 10, we read, when one speaks of emptiness as the nature of phenomena, one in no sense propounds nihilism. So the point Nagarjuna is making here is that the teaching on emptiness presents all phenomena to be empty because they are dependent, because they are devoid of independent nature. So therefore, emptiness is presented as the true nature of things. And because they are true nature of things, and there are phenomena whose true nature we can talk about. So therefore, the teaching on emptiness does not constitute a form of nihilism, because here we are talking about emptiness as being the ultimate nature of things. And this is, of course, presented very clearly in Nagarjuna's fundamental wisdom of the middle way, Mula Madhyamaka Karika, where he explains the meaning of emptiness in terms of dependent origination, when he says that that which is dependently originated, that has been taught to be empty. So here he equates the meaning of dependent emptiness with dependent origination. So therefore, since emptiness is the ultimate nature of things, therefore the teaching on emptiness does not constitute a form of nihilism. And similarly, Nagarjuna writes that by the same token, one does not propound eternalism either. So what Nagarjuna is presenting here is that this emptiness, which is the ultimate nature of things, itself is not truly existent. Itself is dependently originated. So unlike the mind-only school, where having rejected the imputed nature, they attribute true existence to emptiness. Whereas in the Nagarjuna's teaching, not only are phenomena empty, but also emptiness of phenomena is also emptiness. Therefore, one speaks of emptiness. And because of this, and there is also no danger of falling into eternalism. So in this way, the teaching on emptiness guards one from both the extremes of absolutism and nihilism.
That issue de malignasm kawaii todu yana juni ji sheso sungni den juni chawan ko minum tu de so ta umabe any tanyegi any kinji bana diji consideration tanyebe chu consideration and de chi nang de chi de ni song nang 주 semjengi kichi di denji devanjo ran shi jikso chi denji semi pembushe di ju de gen samla denji jue denji jikso sa denga di chig di chan sa da chig di le mi de ju anda 장제 동과문 문제나 디 송요 다 chig chim지 jan 루문도 가야 chig 그게 내 랑수 체면로야 진짜 가르사 치드 머시브 루스 미그 타만 땡이는 계긴 저식 런리 모주장 차셜 타베 넘리 마와는 계긴 저식 랑세 모주장 땡지 짜베 실sun 캠본나 계긴 저식 야도가 다한테 이게 풍속 최대면은 용구말에 세다 즉 우주적대야디 치든 시그널 드기면도 세네다 치든 니구도 세네 치든 니야 된다리야 아니 참에 시기요 봐 진짜 오모바 데 고물루고 투모모이 오메루다 오메베 셰바리야 치든 거기도 와 더 오메베 나는 치든 강에 줘요 할때 얘네 때 빼면서 거 야오래 치든 많이 해야지 땅든 세는 많이 벌어 땅든 세는 많이 버디 낭 짐벌에 찍버리스 낭 짐벌야 땅든 세는 많이 버디기 매버 샤워 주나 쳐 가야 매버 차는 거 그래서 낭 짐벌 땅든 세는 미니 버리디 이제 마다 맞아면 안에 명상기 짐벌 샤 차나 치든야 땅든 세는 니야 요말디 마다 맞아면 안에 치든 샤 줘 그래서 송진이부디 타녀도 여념 대한다 말 매념 샤소 자상가 치든 것이고 루스미그스 딘지소 다 센자베 정리 그 타네 다 지금 우주 때문에 시작해야 돼 샘디 체면로다 다 샤진 제지가 남샤 디다 개처부진 송구여 인도산에 다 디터네 랑리 두고요 봐 세상에다 랑리 모두 저 차샤타에 되셔야들이 참마다 샤자 뜨는 저 샤용 인도산에 랑리 개셔고도 봐 이네 랑리 간에 샤진 제지가 남샤 뚜두 데모 전 샤토바 인도산에 남리 마도 투데마나스 나 우모버 타녀도 랑세 시겐즈 타녀도라고 생이 뭐 죽나 타녀면 주변 최신 매바라 차용기 아니 땡제 양라 주니스야들 용구민도 세네다 내가들 내는 거 알아 산다 디견민도 랑세 뭐 죽장 땡제 따야스 식성 캠보는 계진저 실세네 어디로 손래 저서 내 오늘도 왔다 안데 디디 고모고모디도 막다 고모고모 지 견시 통니 견시 세야가 된다라 지 당연 락바직 직시다 마샤감이 차오르와 와다 띠견천이야 말이지 엄마베다 반단 다소 어디 고물루르고 싶어 투모 모임 봐다 산재장다 다와 잡에 째셔 봐 상당연데 그 균음에 지 차는 거 리베나가 천음에 되지 리베나가 천음에 되네 당진은 푸는 내 통해지 들으시도 봐 现在个主动嘛是大学的大面的修下面全都是没得用的呀大概那些个电子厂门的开不出去电子让不开的用电子厂门的开不出去用用的这上面我上面呢哦但我那真的人啥什么这个什么定呢就朝着开去对不起东西都要么的东西都是基本上是大事东西都要么的因为都车入去呢 면로 삼아르지. 다들 내 집에서 용되게 하래. 사실 리면 있잖아요. 그 더그시다. 저로 순수하네. 직도가 섬나 지금 소마도 면라지 용도가. 어디를 시작. 사동이사 다 시다. 먼저 가서래. 몸으로 주로서 그 프로페서즈 다 아주 숨을 살게 되면도 봐. 때문에 자네 아주 일이 쳐야 나로 쉬우지 너희들 그러셔.
So we read in stanza 59, starting with ignorance and ending with aging, all processes that arise from the 12 links of dependent origination, we accept them to be like a dream and like an illusion. So here Nagarjuna is explaining that while rejecting any notion of true existence in the teaching of emptiness, one can still maintain a robust and coherent notion of reality. And here he explains reality in terms of dependent origination pertaining to the external world, and dependent origination pertaining to the internal world of sentient beings. And of course, the origination of sentient beings is explained in terms of the 12 links of the Buddha's teaching, 12 links of dependent origination. So here, the key principle that is being invoked is the principle of cause and effects. So on the basis of the law of cause and effects, Doji wrote a text called Songs on the View, Recognizing My Mother's Face, or Recognizing My Mother, in which he wrote the following stanza, which of course
I mean... Mother in the sense...
emptiness.
The emptiness.
Yeah.
Emptiness is the ultimate nature of everything. So you see, he refer mother.
So in which he, referring to each of the different views of the Buddhist schools, he wrote the following, although the stanza themselves, my recitation of them may not be the exact words, but in the following he writes that given that kind of a conventional notion of external reality can be maintained, therefore the masters of Vaibhashika and Sautrantika do not need to worry too much, because they're having rejected the notion of independent self. For the Vaibhashikas and Sautrantikas, the two Buddhist schools, it was very important to have a robust notion of the world of existence. So therefore they attribute the reality to elementary particles and so on, as we discussed earlier. So what Chankya is saying is that since one can have a robust notion of these external world without grounding their reality in the ultimate, eternal kind of, indivisible, constitutive elements. Therefore, they do not need to worry. These masters do not need to worry. Then, talking to the mind-only school masters, he says that although one, without accepting the notion of this apperceptive, self-cognizing faculty, one can still maintain a coherent notion of subject and object, cognition and the cognized object. Therefore, the mind-only school masters need not worry too much. And then he moves on and says that to those Madhyamaka, middle way philosophers who insist on some notion of intrinsic reality on the conventional level, he says they too need not worry because, despite rejecting any notion of intrinsicness, one can still maintain a coherent understanding of the world of dependent origination. So the masters of the Swatrantika Madhyamaka need not worry. So, so what Chankya is saying here is that if one truly understands the teachings of Nagarjuna, particularly in the unique way in which it has been read by Indian masters like Buddha Palita and Chandrakirti, then one will have a very deep understanding of the final meaning of emptiness, where not even a trace of grasping is left at any notion of objective intrinsic existence. Yet at the same time, within that view, there is a robust, coherent notion of reality within which cause and effect and all conventions operate. Therefore, so if one really examines carefully, one can really come to recognize that in the teaching of Nagarjuna, there is truly the method and the antidote to counter our innate, deeply ingrained grasping at selfhood, deeply ingrained grasping at real existence. And yet at the same time, one does not slide into a form of nihilism. Rather, one, maintains a robust notion of reality. And and at the same time, Nagarjuna's teachings are completely free of any faults, and they can be completely supported by reasoning. So when you think along those lines, of course I'm not claiming that I have realized emptiness, but I can say that I've kind of tasted it, so at least a little bit. So when you dwell deeply on the true meaning of emptiness, and when you begin to have a little taste of it, then clearly, when you hear words like emptiness, it conjures and evokes in you a completely different experience, and therefore, so otherwise, one may misunderstand the teachings of the Nagarjuna, because the teachings of Nagarjuna, someone like Nagarjuna, cannot be seen, seen as any kind of academic professor who was developing some kind of speculative views. Rather, Nagarjuna's teaching on emptiness are teachings that have direct relevance to our own experience and our own quest for enlightenment.
Yeah. That is what they do. Did you tune it? Did you tune it? Don't get this lemon. The Chukju. Did you somebody? Did you somebody? There is some shivani. Simshi one moment. Moment tiny top of the tiny top of 12 top euros. These someday, did you tune in the Kanda Duni Mishiva, Tata Tarbe Demai, Duru Sibe Journey, Mogata Corn.
So then I will single out the next two stanzas. Stanza 70, which is on page 12, it reads, "A happy mind, it is tranquil indeed. A tranquil mind is not confused. To have no confusion is to understand the truth. By understanding the truth, one attains freedom." And then later on in stanza 72, we read, those who do not understand emptiness are not receptive vehicles for liberation. Such ignorant beings will revolve in the existence prison of 6 classes of beings. So with this, up to this point, that the teaching on the ultimate bodhichitta or ultimate awakening mind has been presented. So then from stanza 73 onwards, the conventional bodhicitta or conventional awakening mind is being presented. So this is what I refer to as altruism at the beginning of opening remarks.
다 점방배 자야연대 타이도 지금 즉 상무지 거용 지금 예바로 신의 유산에 다 랑도 총바 다 나게테도 besimje 수도 수인네 몽배 상황도 규제버디 되게 규를 여르베 몽바디 데루이 버지다 달은 못 담대 여버시 로 샤연도 지 동해든 젠드고로 동해를 좀 되고로 그 내용도 와 내야지도 와 저 지리 인도산에 So
then in stanza 73 we read, when this emptiness as explained is thus meditated upon by yogis, no doubt there will arise in them a sentiment attached to others' welfare. So what Nagarjuna is saying here is that once you have deeper understanding of the meaning of emptiness, then you will come to recognize that there is a possibility of purifying the pollutants of the mind. And so once you come to recognize the possibility of purifying the pollutants of the mind, then a genuine aspiration to seek that freedom, which is freedom from the pollutants of the mind, arises in you. And when you recognize that, you will then recognize that in all the other beings who are entrapped in the cycle of existence, the root cause of their cyclic existence is this ignorant mind grasping at self-existence, in inherent existence. And however, this ignorance, which is the root cause of samsara, is a distorted state of mind which can be removed, which can be eliminated, and there exists a powerful antidote to eliminate it. So once you recognize that, then genuine compassion for all beings who are entrapped in cycle of existence because of the ignorance arises in you. That's why Nagarjuna writes that no doubt there will arise in them a sentiment attached to others' welfare.
지진 경에 된데다 심지어 편바삼식이 마당반에 두순들 가야매로 살지요. 대신도 심년 tundu 이다수세다 즉 간다지 년주 나라 기야디디 아니 아다 심지어 내변 되부레스. 쟤네 다 샤나 편바좀나 랑라 네고도 터두기 디기 타다 좋대야. 심지어는 나바잖아. 네거도 터도 다 단단도 좀 매버 파샤네 차도 있나요? 뭐지고 거랑을 줘봐야지. 돈 대위원도 준주기 딱대 현지 동에다 양다 자월 맞잖아. 상제 니도 민주주의 과완나야 대화 매선 타저 되리셔. 난 전주성으로 로지 장네 상로시 담에 있나? 대외 경계 근세에 전주성게 따시네. 된된 대화는 줘봐도 심시수시 기록으로 송샤 되려도 와. 자, 드리인데 뭐냐라다 실도 남지기 싫어지 이렇게 성부 야오지 땅배이나 동리가 따와 되게 좌체배 동리가 따와 들 때네 청주셔야지 예바 디지컬로시리 동면 대루이 뭐지 다 되네 샹드 되니로 장네 샹의 제시 방법으로 당신 남지관은 다 진진이 견대견대 상당히 되잖아요. 얘네 샹드 되니 그러지 레고도 다 니니 숨도 되니 로토 보시구나 엔다 기분 고쳐버려 되는 대로 로알로 심시수 기능사들이 아니 딘지진도 사네 가시 조신도 지신 난가 내봐도 로치신 내죠 디지단이 내주는 저동의 상쇼사 단면은 저 심다 제윤도 기부도가 쉬우지를 해야 돼 로를 두었던다 쉬우지 하려고
So we read in stanza 76, the fruits which are desirable or undesirable in the form of fortunate or unfortunate births in the world, they come about from helping the sentient beings or harming them. If by relying upon the sentient beings, the unexcelled state of Buddhahood is brought about, so what is so astonishing about the fact that whatever prosperities there are in the gods and humans, such as those enjoyed by Brahma, Indra, and Rudra, and the worldly guardians of the world, there is nothing in this triple world system that is not brought forth by helping others. So, and then the text goes on. But what Nagarjuna is explaining here is that in reality, anything that pertains to our experience of happiness, anything that is good in the world, either directly or indirectly, results or consequences of actions and thoughts that are beneficial to others. In contrast, all the consequences of any actions and thoughts that are harmful to others brings about one's own downfall and all the other undesirable consequences that we see in the world. So in brief, and then the text goes on to say that even birth in the hell realms and so on, all of these are consequences of engaging in actions that are harmful to other sentient beings. So in brief, what Shantideva presents in his Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, where he says that if one does not, exchange self and others and, begins to cherish the welfare of other sentient beings, then not only will one not attain Buddhahood, but even in this lifetime, there will be no happiness. So therefore, all the experiences of happiness, whether even in this lifetime, are in one way or another consequences of actions that are beneficial to other sentient beings. So therefore, if one can reflect deeply, one will truly come to appreciate the value of these two teachings, the teaching on emptiness that we spoke about, which pertains to understanding a deeper nature of reality, and then teaching on altruism, which is the bodhichitta, awakening mind. So when you are able to adopt a path that has a combination of these two practices, then clearly, as Shantideva says in his Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, when he says that, therefore, overcoming any sense of weariness or tiredness, one should ride the horse of bodhichitta, the awakening mind, and then travel from a place of joy to a place of joy. And what sane person or intelligent person would not take joy in making such a journey? So this is truly powerful, because you can, if you really think deeply as a practicing, as a practitioner, if you are able to really implement these two principles, the principle of understanding the nature of reality and the principle of altruism, then clearly a new chapter opens where your whole journey in life opens to a journey towards happiness, a true joy. Therefore, one can truly relate to the sentiments expressed in Shantideva's text when he says that as long as space remains, as long as sentient beings remain, may I too remain and dispel the miseries of the world. So you can then relate to that kind of sentiment and truly have a sense of what genuine, deep, tranquil and happy and joyful mind must feel like.
他说的就是求助。你说，康熙光白淡白你明白的淡白哪着？康熙光白淡白哪？现在东南几天呢？三代带我团来讲，那么办如果吃， Dini Mosar, Dinga, Dini Tambe, Chulucho. Tata Namji Renlu Tang, Nonam Jimbo, Mosarmi, Chenum Dongban Dishene, Ladan de Utambakam. Teni Mosar Vajang, Teni Mosar Vay Mosar, Mejun Vajang, Matuchun. Then other Disonsha. That diggy. Monera, that literature, that was Jangtuna. Any Moneta, she me Namjugi. She never did Zova me Namju, Hoshev Surgery. Namju, Chod Jebe, me, Hasan, Ningdo Didi, Moneta, Shasanshi, so turn to a surgery. Yaodo, Tawato, Tanadama, said Vajrayana.
So then we read from stanza 86, where Nagarjuna writes, when through practice it becomes firm, he's talking about bodhichitta, then alarmed by others' suffering, the bodhisattvas renounce the bliss of concentration and plunge even to the depths of relentless hells. This is indeed amazing, praiseworthy it is. This is the excellent way of the sublime. That they give away their own flesh and wealth is not surprising at all. Those who understand this emptiness of phenomena, yet also conform to the law of karma and its results, that is more amazing than amazing. That is more wondrous than wondrous. So if one can train one's mind along these lines, on the basis of the teaching on emptiness and altruism as outlined in this text, then clearly one will be able to bring the optimal potential that lies in the human mind and would make the human intelligence most meaningful and would have achieved and served its purpose. And in this way, one will be able to cultivate the greatest amount of courage and also greatest degree of altruism. And once you're able to do those things, then truly the expression making one's human existence meaningful would come to be real.
That is the Shologa Jada Shi. Oh, the Jada Shidi, Ningjiruji, Sonamjur, Dungniruji, Chojo, Dada Shanju, Drujandu, Kandun Teda, Yasay, Mobukunji Talandu. Sibusum도 다쳐 상계 동네 초전도 직전적으로 찾아 슉 어다디
So then we will read from stanza 103, which is on page 17. The single taste of compassion is merit. The taste of emptiness is most excellent. Those who drink the elixir of emptiness to realize self and others' welfare are conquerors' children. Bow to them with your entire being. They are always worthy of honor in the three worlds. These guides of the world reside as representatives of the Buddhas.
Yeah. So those, I think, Buddhist practitioner, as they practice these lines, then we become genuine follower of Buddha, not only follower, but also to be
representatives of the Buddha.
So, let us try to put in implementation, practice.
Implement them in practice.